Okay, let's crack on to the government. We're making fairly good time. So the plan is to have a look at some example essays at the end once we've had a look at all the content. I should possibly pause for any questions in the chat. I do think some more questions from you guys would be, good. You should get into the habit of trying to ask questions. You've only got me 1 hour a week at the end of the day. You can send questions, privately, of course, but if you have spur of the moment questions, get them answered. I do sometimes worry that if students aren't asking questions, they're just sitting there absorbing, which might not sound like a bad thing, but it's not actually the best way to learn, to be too passive, to be just sitting there, absorbing, not interacting or engaging. So questions, put them in the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to government. And then we'll talk about the economy as a whole as well. So I'll put both of those on the board now, actually. So for the government, there is going to be pressure on government spending to increase. Meanwhile, the real value of government debt falls. And then for economy as a whole, you talk about how a wage cost spiral will be very negative for growth because it's going to be sort of like a series of leftward shifts of aggregate supply. But I'm going to add in some new ones here. Total spending, the expectations. And finally, international competitiveness. Ooh. Okay, so again, we'll go through these bit by bit. So the government, pressure on the government to increase spending. This is for a number of reasons, really, but I think the most logical one and the easiest one is just think about what we said about firms, and remember that the government is also a major employer, right? Firms are not the only institutions that employ workers. The government employs tons and tons of workers, particularly education, healthcare, as I'm sure you're all aware. So the same problem that firms have with workers asking for higher wages is going to affect the government as well, right? So, and you've seen that so clearly recently with the number of strikes related to inflation matching wages. You've seen that in schools, right? Teachers striking, asking for wages that are more in line with the inflation rate. And whilst Rishi Sunak's government, they took a very hard line against the teacher strike at first and said, we're not going to budge. We've made a previous offer. That's all we're going. Eventually, they had to capitulate, I guess, to the pressure from the unions and the problems they were creating for the state sector, and pay them. I don't think it was inflation matching, but certainly much closer to the inflation matching wage increase. So obviously, this doesn't come out of profits because the government isn't a profit-driven institution, but it is going to mean higher government spending and then potentially, although I don't think it's necessary to talk about this in, say, the essay, but potentially higher taxes in order to fund that spending, right? Or possibly more borrowing. And that's probably why I wouldn't necessarily talk about higher taxes. But one of the two, higher taxes, more borrowing in order to fund that government spending. And that is going to move the government to what we call a budget deficit as well, where they might be in danger of spending too much money compared to the tax revenue that they're generating. So first point for the government is just potential for higher government spending. And notice that I'm not saying they will definitely have to spend more. If you think about the recent UK example I gave, it kind of depends on how powerful the trade unions are, how persuasive they are, how much public support they have, how popular the government is at the time. but the government doesn't have to pay public sector workers more, but it's definitely going to be under pressure to do so. You imagine, just like a firm really doesn't have to pay workers more. It's going to be under pressure to do so, and it may suffer economic consequences if it doesn't, by workers leaving for another sector. But okay, real value of government debt falls. Now you can do this for consumers as well. For consumers that are in debt, the real value of debt falls, and for consumers that have positive equity, net wealth basically, they're typically going to have savings, and the value of savings decreases as well. So you can extend this point to consumers. I think it is a really good point for consumers, to be fair. It can be a bit tricky, and I think you've got to wrap your head around how inflation affects savings and debt. Whereas I like it with the government because you don't really have to worry so much about the whole saving aspects. You can just focus on how inflation reduces the value of debt. But the reasoning here is quite simple, even though the term real value of debt falls is possibly quite confusing. Just think of it this way. Imagine you borrow £1,000 from me. Yeah, I have a good reason, let me tell you. But imagine you borrow £1,000 from me, and at the moment, just for argument's sake, a TV costs £500. So if a TV costs £500, how many TVs worth of money have you borrowed from me? Don't worry about putting in the chat. I think that one's too easy for me to get a chat answer for. But if you borrow £1,000 and the TV costs 500, you have borrowed two TVs worth of money, right? So, i.e., you have borrowed enough money from me to buy yourself two TVs, or what we might say an equivalent amount of goods to two TVs. Maybe if a carrot costs £1, you could buy 1,000 carrots. But keep it nice and simple. TV costs £500. You've borrowed £1,000 from me. I've therefore lent you enough money to buy two TVs. Now, let's say next year is when you have to pay me back at the end of the year, and inflation means a TV now costs £1,000. Okay, so you pay me back my £1,000 at the end of the year, and we might be thinking, well, that's all good, that's all nice. You borrowed the £1,000, you paid me back £1,000. But why am I left feeling like actually I've got a really bad deal out of this? The lender and you, the borrower, have got a really, really good deal out of it. Because if a TV now costs £1,000, I gave you enough money to buy two TVs. Krishna's put a great answer in, I think. I gave you enough money to buy two TVs, and you've only given me back enough money to buy one TV. That's not your fault. It's not something you did on purpose. The TVs just went up in price. It's just bad luck for me that I lent you enough money to buy two TVs, but I'm only going to get enough money back to buy one. But the fact is, I am getting back less than I gave in terms of the value of that money, not in terms of how much money I'm getting back. I lent £1,000, I get back £1,000, but the money is worth less when inflation occurs because it doesn't buy as much stuff, right? £1,000 used to buy you two TVs. It's a lot of TVs, right? Now £1,000 only gets you one TV. Therefore, by definition, that same £1,000 isn't worth as much money. And if you notice what's happened in that scenario, the borrower should feel pretty good. They've benefited quite a lot because they borrowed a higher value of money than they had to give back. They borrowed enough money to buy two TVs, then you had to give back enough to buy one. Whereas the lender is going to feel pretty bad because when they get the money back, it's not as valuable as it used to be. They can't buy as much with that money. So the same principle applies to the government. And I think it's a really good point for the government because pretty much every government is a debtor. It's something we can talk more about when we talk about government finances in detail, but pretty much every government is in debt. I don't know a single one, which doesn't mean there isn't one, but I don't know a single one that isn't in some sort of debt, whereas obviously that's not true of all consumers. So for the government, inflation has this really interesting positive side effect of reducing the value of government debt. which is often in, like we all know, the UK's government debt, right, around £2 trillion. So nice round number. A reduction in the value of that debt, the real value of that debt, can be very beneficial. A really good historical example of this is the UK's war debt following World War II was, as you might imagine, astronomical. A lot of obviously spending for survival's sake on military purposes, way more than they would normally spend. So they went into a lot of debt over the course of World War II. And a lot of economists were very worried about how the UK would pay off its debt. But funny enough, the periods of inflation post-war being relatively high compared to modern day actually meant the real value of that debt, the UK's war debt, decreased a lot and effectively made it easier to pay back because inflation, more money is being generated in the economy at the same time as that inflation. So again, it comes down to the demand pull versus cost push thing. But they were generating more money, and then the money that they have to pay back isn't worth as much as it was before. So they're effectively getting a better deal out of their borrowing, exactly as I've described here. It just might be for tanks instead. The government in the war borrowed enough money to buy 1,000 tanks, but it only had to give 100 tanks worth of money back due to inflation, for example. Okay, I've got some questions from Krishna here. I'm not sure if it's an answer to a question or a question. Okay, sorry, sir. What's G plus O? It's not a plus. Sorry, that's my handwriting. Government spending to increase. Oh, I think someone else has corrected that. So okay, you've got it. Okay. Any other questions? Throw them in the chat. Again, questions like Christian's done exactly the right thing there, even though I will admit I've got confused by this stream of consciousness in the chat. But he's done the right thing. Get the questions in there. Keeps you focused as well. So okay. Any others, put them in there. Otherwise, I will move on to the economy as a whole. But yeah, to wrap this up, you're basically saying the government kind of wins when there's inflation because the government's always in debt. Basically, as I've said, every government is in debt. And when inflation happens, the value of debt reduces. So what you owe back to people isn't worth as much as it was before. If any of this gets like complicated, ground your understanding in a really simple hypothetical example. That's always what I do in economics, particularly macro, is if I'm struggling to understand something, I'll take it back to like a really simple hypothetical example with TVs or carrots or whatever. Okay, so economy as a whole then. Let's have a look here. So the total spending via expectations argument. This is quite a complex one, I think, but generally seen quite fondly by examiners. I think you'll be quite impressed if the student does this point very well. So it's worth learning, worth going for. So the idea here is that inflation affects people's spending based on their expectations of future prices. Let me explain that, because that's a lot of it. So people don't just spend based on what's going on now, present information. They also spend based on what they expect to happen in future. Just think about it. If you, and we saw this during COVID actually, if you think toilet roll prices are going to rise massively, what do you go out and do? You buy loads of toilet rolls, you hoard them before they go up in price. If you think house prices are going to be rising 5-10% a year and you're worried about ever getting onto the housing ladder, you try and get a house as quickly as possible before they rise in price. So as I said, consumer spending isn't just based on present information, what's going on in the present. A consumer will also be thinking about, what do I expect prices to be like in future? Because if I expect prices to rise in future, I'm going to try and buy now before they rise. But if I expect prices to fall in future, I might hold back my spending and wait until they fall. So that is the basic idea here. And this idea of inflation expectations as well is really influential in a lot of modern macroeconomic theory. One of the things the Bank of England governor has been saying recently with regards to inflation in the UK is he's very keen to control inflation expectations and to try and prevent people expecting higher inflation to happen. So this can it can have good and bad effects. So in one way, it can be good because people will be spending more, right? So in some way, a level of inflation is good for the economy because it encourages more spending. And that's actually why we do aim for some inflation, like 1 to 3% inflation. We want a bit of inflation because it encourages more spending. So basically, consumption will increase due to uh, people effectively hoarding, but I'm not going to use that phrase, people buying in fear of future price rises. So that's how I'm going to summarize it and write it down pretty badly, but consumption increases due to people buying in fear of future price rises. Okay, so they're scared of prices going up in future. They start buying now. And that can be good because consumption is rising. Where we go there, AD, economic growth. So you can see that inflation it can be quite good for growth. In the sense that a little bit of inflation at least encourages spending, which creates more demand, which creates growth. But if this gets out of hand, any idea what argument from earlier we can bring in? This one's not so easy, so I'm going to put it over to you guys. Something I mentioned earlier that could be very relevant here if expectations get out of hand and people start, we say their expectations become embedded. Demand pull inflation from Yash and W, not just demand pull, but yes, it will cause demand pull inflation, but this could then lead to some other consequence I talked about of inflation earlier. Something that is considered a really, really terrifying prospect. Yes. Wage cost spiral. Well on Krishna. A lot of people talking like the right kind of thing, but Krishna's got the spot on name. Wage cost spiral. Exactly. So you can kind of get this double feedback loop on both the demand side and the supply side, where the costs are going up and then the firms are increasing prices, and then people's expectations of inflation are going up because prices have gone up, and then people are spending more, and then that's causing even more inflation on top of the cost inflation. So yes, I'm getting a bit complicated. I'm sorry if I've run away with it, but you can kind of have this horrible, again, this feedback loop, this sort of like compounding effect as inflation just creates more inflation, and you've got people expecting more inflation, which causes them to spend more, which creates more inflation. And then you've got people asking for wage rises, which increases costs, which creates more inflation. So it's almost like a death spiral for the economy, basically. And as I'm sure many of you are aware from like historical examples, Weimar Germany, for example, hyperinflation typically doesn't ever end well or doesn't look good in retrospect, let's say. So, okay, so you can have sort of, let's say, spiral effects again here. And that again is the sort of the feedback loop because consumers, if they expect prices to rise, they go out and buy more, which causes prices to rise, which can increase expectations of price rises, which can cause them to go out and buy more, etc., etc. So, okay, last point then, and then again, I'll take a little break for questions. And yeah, we should have a little time to look at some example essays. Oh, evaluation, actually. Okay, we'll see how we do. So, international competitiveness falls very, very nice and easy. It's just if prices rise, exports are less competitive, right? If your country's suffering inflation, then that literally means your goods and services are getting more expensive for other countries to buy. So it's likely that your exports are going to fall. Demand for exports falls, and then that's going to make the current account worse, on the balance of payments. Current account worst. So this it's going to be easier to expand when you've done the current account in more detail. But this is the basic idea is just your prices are going to be too high potentially, and other countries aren't going to buy your goods because they're going to be too expensive. As a result, there's going to be less money coming into your country through exports. And you could even, if you wanted, link this to aggregate demand falling. If you do that, it creates a really interesting analysis chain and potential evaluative comment because there's a stabilizing effect there, actually, where if you think about what we just said, the fall in exports is going to reduce AD, which is going to help stabilize inflation. So international trade provides a little bit of a little stabilizing effect on inflation, which is quite interesting. But okay, last thing on that one actually is a really nice one to evaluate with depends on the cause of inflation. So we know all inflation is going to make exports more expensive. That's definitely true. But if you think about demand pull inflation, that's going to be much worse for the balance of payments because not only do your exports get more expensive, and so you don't sell as many exports, but as GDP rises, as we discussed before, your consumers can afford more imports. So with demand pull inflation, you are likely to be not only selling less exports because they're too expensive, but you'll be buying more imports because your economy is richer. Whereas with cost push inflation, yes, prices rise, which is going to harm your exports, but in a way, because GDP contracts and your citizens get poorer, they're not going to be buying as many imports, and that's going to help cancel out the drop in exports. So I really love using demand pull versus cost push as an evaluation there.